It was November 17th, 1990, the second day of deer hunting season in Kalamazoo County, Michigan, when Doug Estes, who was 33 and a big hunter, left with his stepson Bobby Brown that afternoon. For Doug Estes, this hunt had a special significance. It was also an opportunity to spend quality time with his stepson, Bobby. The events of this day did not go as planned. Gunshots were heard in the quiet woods by Helen Knopfs and her son, who lived in that area. It was not unusual. As they approached the sound of the shots, she encountered a car accident. They got close to the car so they could help the man inside. Strangely, they met a man who was soaked in sweat, looked worried, and didn't seem friendly. He turned down their offers of help and said that he was in trouble because a deer ran out into the road. Even though the answer made sense, something about the man's behavior was strange. He seemed eager to leave, and Knopfs couldn't get rid of the feeling that he was trying to hide something. She offered to call the cops, but the man was strongly against it, so he got in his car and left. Meanwhile, Bobby Brown continued further into the woods as the minutes passed, eagerly awaiting the time when he and his stepfather could celebrate their successful hunt. But what he found was a horrifying scenario. Doug Estes was bleeding to death on the ground. It took Bobby a few seconds to process what he had just seen. Jim Bennet, beside Doug's corpse, was lying face down in the mud. Bobby was completely overwhelmed with shock and disorientation. There were 2 gunshots heard, but only 1 bullet was found. The fact that the 2 hunters, Doug Estes and Jim Bennet, didn't know each other added a further layer of intrigue to the story. There was no known history or link between them. They were just 2 people who happened to meet on this fateful day. Detective Bruce Wiersama and Sergeant Roy Ballard were put in charge of solving the mystery that had broken Kalamazoo County's peace. It was a hard job because murders didn't happen here very often. The police had a hard time figuring out what happened. There were 2 strangers, 2 gunshots, and no reason or link between the victims. At first, the idea that the shooters accidentally shot each other during the chase didn't seem likely, since both of them had been shot in the back by 1 shot. When ballistic tests showed that the guns used were different, the investigation became even more strange. It didn't seem likely that the 2 people had shot each other. Also, Doug Estes' gun was nowhere to be found at the scene of the crime. This made the case even more confusing. As the detectives delved deeper into the mystery, suspicion began to focus on Bobby Brown, Doug Estes' stepson. Investigators started to believe that Bobby had planned to rob Jim Bennet, but that the robbery had gone wrong, killing both men. The families of the victims, on the other hand, were sure that Bobby was innocent and didn't agree with this idea. They couldn't believe that Bobby, who they knew well, could have done something so horrible. Even though the families had questions, the agents kept going with their ideas. They went back to the crime scene, talked to neighbors, and tried to figure out what happened on that terrible day. The case got more complicated when a sketch was found that was based on what Helen Knopfs said. The sketch looked like Thomas Dillon, a serial killer who used to kill hunters and other people who liked the outdoors. But a new clue took them in a different direction than they had planned at the start of their search. Jeff Titus, a local farmer who lives close to the Fulton State Game Area, was the subject of an investigation. People knew that Titus was very protective of his land and would fight anyone, especially hunters, who tried to get on it. People started to worry about Titus because Doug Estes and Jim Bennet might have broken into his property without permission. On the other hand, Titus couldn't be found guilty because he had a good reason why he wasn't there. He was on a shooting trip when the murder happened. He was 27 miles away from where it happened. He said that he found the gun near where the murder happened and kept it so that no one else could be blamed for it. Even though there was more and more proof against him, he still had a strong alibi. A cold case unit opened the case up 10 years later and arrested Titus as a prime suspect in 2001. Prosecutors at the time argued that he would have had enough time to drive to the location of the crime and back. While there was no physical evidence against Titus, prosecutors portrayed him as a hothead who didn't like trespassers, according to the Associated Press. Although there was no physical evidence, and it was based on assumptions only, Titus was found guilty in 2002 and given 2 straight life sentences with no chance of getting out. In neither of his terms was there a way for him to get out early. Even though the problem seemed to have been fixed, there was still a long way to go. In 2019, true crime reporter Jacinda Davis and podcaster and former lawyer Susan Simpson found out about the Jeff Titus case on their own. Their investigations would lead to shocking discoveries that put Titus's verdict into question. Because they worked together, they were able to make a true crime documentary, Killer in Question, and a podcast, Undisclosed, that looked at the case from every point. As they looked into the case more, they found things that didn't make sense and information that hadn't been given to Titus's defense team during the first hearing. They found a possible link between the killings and the serial killer, Thomas Dillon. They found out that a witness had identified Thomas Dillon as a man who drove his car into a ditch after 2 shots were fired on the day of the shooting. Dillon, a convicted serial killer known as the Ohio Outdoorsman Killer, was not disclosed to those investigating the Kalamazoo cold case. With this new knowledge, Titus's guilt started to be called into question. The Michigan State Attorney General's office and the Innocence Clinic at the University of Michigan looked at the case in depth. When a secret file was found in the records, it gave important clues about Thomas Dillon and other mystery hunter murders in the area. During the first hearing, this film was never given to the defense, which raised major questions about how fair the procedures were. Jeff Titus got the news that he was going to be let out of prison on February 16, 2023, after being locked up for more than 20 years. When they decided to throw out his sentence, it was a time of joy and relief. Titus, who is now 71 years old, walked out of prison with tears of joy and was met by a group of people who had worked hard to prove his innocence. His freedom was the end of a long fight for justice that had been going on for decades. However, the case of Doug Estes and Jim Bennet remains a mystery. The questions surrounding their murders persist. The ultimate truth about what happened on that November day in 1990 may never be fully revealed, as Dillon passed away in 2011. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you want to watch more videos like this.